During a live congressional hearing, a white former attorney general looked directly at Jasmine Crockett and told her to go back to Africa. Jasmine's response wasn't loud, but it was decisive. Instead of arguing, she opened a Justice Department file that documented years of racial discrimination under Bondi's leadership, including harsher sentencing for black defendants and political pressure to target minority communities for voter support. So the question is, what happens when truth enters a place of power and refuses to step aside? Stay with us. This is a story worth your time. Washington, D.C. Wednesday morning. The air outside was dry and sharp. Inside Capitol Hearing Room 4A, every seat was taken long before the session began. Cameras lined the back wall. Network crews, reporters, and independent streamers, all focused on the two microphones at the center of the floor. This wasn't a routine congressional meeting. It was a hearing on racial bias in the American criminal justice system. People were not there just to listen, they were there to witness, to see whether justice in this country truly operates blindly or simply looks away from certain skin tones. On the left side of the table sat Jasmine Crockett, a black congresswoman from Texas and former criminal defense attorney with more than 100 courtroom wins. She wore a navy suit, sat straight-backed with steady focus, and commanded the attention of the room like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Jasmine wasn't there to perform. She was there to present facts. She represented a new generation in American politics, young, sharp, and unafraid to confront long-standing flaws in the system, not with emotion alone but with documented evidence. Across from her sat Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, blonde, composed, and carrying the confidence of years in high-profile legal roles. Her career had been shaped by strict, tough-on-crime policies praised by conservatives and criticized by civil rights advocates for racial disparities in prosecution. Today, she wasn't standing behind a podium or speaking from a place of authority. She was expected to answer questions. But this wasn't simply an exchange between two officials. It was a meeting point between two very different American experiences. One side pushed for reform, accountability, and equity. The other defended tradition, order, and the fear that major changes could unsettle a country often unwilling to acknowledge its own problems. Two women, two racial backgrounds, two different visions for the nation, and one unresolved question hanging between them. Does justice in America see color? The room had finally settled. Cameras were fixed in place, their red lights blinking like patient eyes. Pages stopped turning. Every phone was silent. Reporters held their pens in midair, prepared not just to take notes, but to record a defining moment. It was that kind of day, the kind that becomes a footnote in history, the kind people remember long after it ends. A senior clerk stood and formally opened the hearing. The Committee on Justice and Civil Rights will now come to order. Chairs shifted. Jackets were adjusted. The chairman, a gray-haired representative from Oregon with a voice like sandpaper, made brief opening remarks before turning to Jasmine Crockett. She cleared her throat once, not out of unease but concentration. Her eyes didn't scan the room. They held it with steady focus. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Today, I speak not as an opponent but as a witness to a pattern we've all observed and rarely addressed. I hope we can review not only the statutes. She didn't get to finish. Pam Bondi leaned forward, her tone smooth, precise, and unmistakably dismissive. Maybe, she said, instead of trying to lecture America on justice, you should go back to Africa and study your own roots. The silence that followed was immediate and chilling. Not surprised silence. Intentional, controlled, and unsettling. A heartbeat passed. Then another. A young black aide turned his head. A woman in the audience gasped, her hand frozen halfway to her coffee. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. And then the room fell completely still. The weight of those words lingered in the space between the microphones and marble columns, stripping away any remaining sense of decorum. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't pull back or raise her voice. She stayed completely still. Not out of uncertainty, but control. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her posture steady and unaffected by the tension rising around her. Only her eyes moved. They lifted slowly and focused on Pam Bondi, calm and deliberate. There was no anger in her expression, only concentrated attention. Her face didn't accuse. It evaluated. Across the room, staff members shifted. A reporter paused mid-sentence, pen suspended in the air. The pressure in the chamber shifted, no longer centered on the slur itself, but on the response everyone knew was coming. Then Jasmine spoke, her voice measured, quiet, and impactful in its simplicity. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "What did you just say?" It wasn't a request for repetition. It was a moment of accountability. The question didn't fill the room. It cleared it, forcing everyone to face the reality of what had been said. No longer something that could be brushed aside. No murmurs followed, no whispers. Just the tense awareness that the hearing had moved from legal discussion to a moral reckoning. Jasmine didn't move, but her presence felt larger. Her tone held no defensiveness, only clarity and control, with an unspoken signal that something more substantive was coming. Pam Bondi stood with slow, deliberate composure, the kind that doesn't soften a statement but reinforces it. She didn't stumble over her words or raise her voice. Every gesture was controlled, as though she had already decided she would not retreat. Her eyes swept the room, moving past cameras, staff, and representatives, before settling directly on Jasmine. She smoothed the hem of her blazer, a small movement that looked calm but carried the weight of someone bracing themselves. She leaned forward, adjusted the microphone, and spoke clearly, aiming her words beyond the chamber and toward viewers across the country. "I said, if you think this country is so unjust, so flawed, then maybe you should go back to Africa and fix that instead." The words didn't echo. Not because they lacked volume, but because the impact arrived too sharply, too directly. For a moment, the air itself felt suspended. It wasn't quiet from calm, it was quiet from pressure, like the entire room had been forced into holding its breath at once. A senator seated near the back shifted uneasily but stayed quiet. A congressional aide dropped her pen and didn't bother picking it up. The camera crew remained still, yet one of them instinctively tightened the zoom, as if trying to capture the moment of shame more clearly for viewers across the country. Millions of televisions were already replaying the sentence, uncensored and unedited, on every major news network. Captions were appearing instantly, words that didn't just offend, they exposed something deeper, something that had always been present beneath formal suits, policy language, and polished civility. In this moment, it wasn't about discussion. It wasn't even about political rivalry. It was about what had just been spoken, and the fact that it was said into a live microphone permanently added to the government record. No one could claim they missed it. Pam had launched her words like a weapon, but once released, they were no longer hers to control. The silence that followed belonged to Jasmine, and everyone recognized it. Jasmine didn't react sharply. She didn't raise her hands, didn't call for order, didn't raise her voice. What she did instead was far more unsettling for those who expected her to break. She remained still, taking a steady breath, her eyes lowered slightly as if weighing not only her response, but the right way to deliver it. Then she rose. The legs of her chair scraped softly, yet the sound carried enough weight to draw the room's attention. She didn't hurry or act for the cameras. She simply pushed her chair back and stepped away from the table. Her heels made a light, measured sound against the marble floor. She walked forward, not toward Pam, but toward the center of the room. The aisle between the rows could have looked like a stage, but she wasn't performing. She was establishing her place. And by the time she reached the middle, every person, from aides to senators to camera operators, was watching only her. She stood upright, hands resting at her sides, expression calm. She didn't need to raise her voice. The room was already focused on her. When she began speaking, her voice was gentle, yet carried clearly through the space, steady and controlled. "I was born in Texas," she said, pausing briefly before continuing. "My father served in the United States military. He wore the uniform, followed every order, and put his life on the line for this country. My mother was a nurse, someone who cared for anyone who needed help. She never asked what her patients believed or what their background was. She simply served. That's how we were raised, to work hard, to help others, and to believe in a country that has not always believed in us." She took a slow breath, and the room shifted. Some people lowered their eyes, while others leaned in, listening more closely. "But my story doesn't begin with them," she said. "It begins with the people who never had the chance to tell theirs. My ancestors didn't book a flight to get here. They didn't come pursuing the American dream. They were taken, chained, forced from their homes, dragged across the Atlantic as cargo, packed into ships so tightly they couldn't stand. They were sold, branded, and pushed into labor on stolen land. For generations, they were told they didn't matter. Not as citizens, not even as human beings. But they survived. They endured. Her voice held no anger, only steady truth, grounded and unembellished. And somehow, she continued, after everything, they still believed in something better. They fought, they built, and they raised new generations. People like me, who continue to believe in this country, even when it forgets us. She shifted her gaze directly toward Pam Bondi. Her tone stayed the same, but her eyes changed. They sharpened, not with hostility, but with clarity. Cold, precise clarity. You want me to go back to Africa? She said, her voice firm and even. Let me explain something. I was here long before you were born. My family's blood was in this soil before your family ever signed a mortgage. We were here before the law allowed us to vote. Before schools opened their doors to us. Before the sidewalks carried our names as part of this nation's history. Her voice stayed steady, though each word carried more weight. You see someone you think doesn't belong. But I'm not the visitor here. I'm part of the foundation. You don't get to ask me to leave a house built on the labor of my ancestors. You don't get to dismiss the work, the suffering, or the dignity that existed long before you could stand in this room. There were no gasps now, only silence. Heavy, focused silence. Jasmine's voice lowered even further. You say I should leave. That I should go back. But my people lived and died here. They were born on this land, worked on it, and were often buried without names, without markers, without fairness. And yet they remained, and I am still here. She paused, not for reaction, but because the moment required space. She looked around the room, not seeking support, only ensuring that her words had reached everyone present. So no, she said quietly but firmly. I'm not going anywhere. I belong here, and I don't need to be reminded of that. Jasmine had affirmed her history, and now she shifted toward something power rarely welcomes. Documentation. She didn't raise her voice or change her expression, but her posture adjusted. Her shoulders straightened, her stance settled, and her hands steadied. Her tone became slightly more direct, moving from personal experience to factual evidence. She returned to her seat only long enough to reach into a simple black leather folder placed beneath her desk. The moment she lifted out the document, the atmosphere in the room changed. It was a thick file with a pale gray cover, marked by a bold red diagonal stamp on the front. Confidential, DOJ, Florida 2018. Several people looked up. Others stayed still. She didn't hold it above her head or make a display of it. She stepped calmly to the center, holding it at waist level, and looked directly at Pam Bondi. There was no emotion in her face, just steady, clear focus. She raised the file slightly, only enough for the committee members to see the stamp. Then she spoke again, her voice controlled. Director of Surgery, Ms. Bondi, she said. I'm assuming this file is familiar to you. This report was sent to the U.S. Department of Justice in 2018, during your final year as Florida's Attorney General. There was no reply, and none was required. The silence felt heavier now. Not just tense, but waiting. Jasmine opened the folder slowly. Inside were pages that were worn, marked, and heavily notated. She knew the document thoroughly. She had reviewed it more times than she liked to admit. She turned to the first marked tab, her thumb pressing down firmly. The soft rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. She did not read immediately. She allowed the presence of the report to settle, to be seen. Then she lifted her eyes, not toward the audience or the cameras, but directly at the woman who had told her to go back to Africa. This document, she said clearly, is not an opinion. It is not rumor. It is not something I created. It is a federal review submitted during your administration, examining racial bias in the criminal prosecution system in your state. She stood with the file open, its weight suddenly more evident. Her tone did not rise, but the tension around her did. Every page she turned deepened the silence. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like someone handling something delicate. Not dramatic, simply precise. She reached the first tab. Her thumb rested on a chart covering half the page, highlighted in yellow under the overhead lights, bold and impossible to overlook. She did not scan the room for a reaction. She looked down and read. According to this internal review from the Florida Department of Justice, Black defendants received recommended sentences that were, on average, 32% longer than white defendants facing the same charges. She lifted her head, not theatrically, but directly, as if asking, "Can anyone explain this?" No one did, she continued. Same charge, same courtroom, sometimes even the same judge. Yet one person receives probation and another receives years. She turned to the next tab. A small red note protruded from the page. She skimmed the paragraph briefly, then read aloud. Prosecutors showed a documented pattern, this is the report's wording, of upgrading charges when a defendant's last name appeared to be African or Hispanic in origin. That means the only difference was the name. Not the evidence. Not the facts. Just the name. Her voice did not waver, but it slowed. It needed to, because these were not abstract numbers, they were people. Your last name could be Martinez, Abdul, or King. And that alone could determine whether you received community service or prison time. The report doesn't offer theories about intent. It doesn't have to. The data is clear. She turned another page, more slowly now. The kind of slow that makes listeners hold their breath. Page 47, she said quietly. Analysis of wrongful arrests across the state. 87% occurred in predominantly Black or Latino neighborhoods. 87%. She paused to let the weight of it settle before continuing. Of those cases, fewer than 5% received any official apology. Not 0, resulted in financial compensation. People were arrested, taken from their homes, publicly humiliated, sometimes held for days, and then released. No explanation. No accountability. No justice. The findings were severe, the trends unmistakable. But what followed was what quieted even the strongest offender. A sentence written by one of the report's own investigators. The pages no longer shook in Jasmine's hands. Her voice was steady, almost measured, like delivering a decision after a long process. For years, these issues were ignored, she said evenly. She did not raise her tone or exaggerate the moment. She simply read, slowly and clearly, as she turned to a tabbed page near the